The first and only time that I ever used a bow and arrow was with my father-in-law, who you need to know is an avid hunter. He had just purchased a brand new set, and he wanted to demonstrate it, show it off to Gina and me. It was a crisp, cool autumn day, and we went outside. And for the sake of the demonstration, he went and got a stuffed plastic deer and set it about, 100 yards off in the distance. And then my father-in-law came back. He picked up that bow and an arrow, and he pulled it back, calm, cool, and collected. And in the blink of an eye, he released the bow, and the arrow went whoosh, slicing, soaring through the air, and landed right on target. And then he looked at Gina and myself and sort of prompted us to come and use the bow and arrow. Now, me being a gentleman, of course, I said, well, Gina, go right ahead. Be my guest. Well, Gina stepped up. She took that bow and arrow, and like Katniss from the Hunger Games, she pulled it back, and it went soaring, slicing right through the air, right next to her father's arrow. Well, now the pressure's on, right? This is my pride and my ego on the line here. So I start to feel myself sweating a little bit. I looked at Dennis and Gina and said, is it hot here? Whew. I picked up the bow and arrow. I was shaky. My hand was a little sweaty. I pulled it back, and I looked at that deer, and the first thought that came into my mind was, Bambi! And I thought, what a cute deer. How in the world? Well, I said to myself, I've got to get myself collected here. And so I decided I would close my eyes. Choir, that's not a good idea if you're aiming at something. Well, I released the arrow, but instead of that soaring sound, that whoosh that I heard with Gina and Dennis's arrow, mine kind of made this wimpy. It went like 10 feet, and the arrow buried itself beneath some leaves, and no matter how much we searched for it, we could never find that arrow. It's probably still there to this day. And funny story, my father-in-law's never invited me back to use his bow and arrow. In some ways, I wish John's comments at the beginning of our gospel reading today would disappear like that arrow. It is hard enough in our world today trying to wrap our minds around what does healing look like, what does healing sound like, what does healing feel like in our modern scientific world. But then John has to go and be like some bull in a china shop and bring up the topic of sin as well. And conventional wisdom would say to me this morning, don't talk about sin. Just ignore that John even mentioned it. After all, I'm only 4 weeks into my ministry with you. This could be the shortest pastorate ever, right? But John won't let us rest. He doesn't just want to stir the pot this morning. He brings in some industrial strength mixer, sets it on high, and leaves us as the people of God to try to sort through this passage today. Now, for some of you, I am sure you have heard more than enough in your church-going life on the topic of sin. But for me, growing up in the 70s and 80s in the mainline church, I don't think I heard a single sermon on the word sin. I think we were so wrapped up in the pop psychology of I'm okay and you're okay, let's just all sing Kumbaya together, that we never talked about brokenness. We never talked about separation. And the pastor was afraid to use the word sin. So is there a way that we can recapture, begin to talk about this word? Because let's face it, brothers and sisters, just because the mainline church I grew up in didn't talk about it, other churches are more than willing to spend sermon after sermon, pile words upon words, and in some cases, bad theology upon those three little letters, S-I-N. How can we open our imaginations to think about this word anew for today? You see, for Jesus, and his disciples, in the time in which they lived, immersed in the Jewish faith, there was no singular definition of sin. And they certainly did not have the understanding of original sin that so many of us grew up hearing about. Jesus, it would have been a completely foreign concept to Jesus to think about sin somehow being intricately interwoven into his DNA. No. There was no one understanding of sin for Jesus. In fact, there may have been 3 or more understandings, definitions, distinctive definitions of that word. One of which, one Hebrew word for sin, essentially means missing the mark. Hence my opening story at the beginning of the sermon, right? It all makes sense. Sometimes in our lives, I think we do miss the mark. Maybe we're talking to a good friend who's going through a difficult time in his or her life, and we find ourselves starting to say things. Words are coming out of our mouth that sound trite or that we don't even believe in, and we want to stop ourselves, but we just can't, right? We feel sometimes like our life is missing the mark, like we're aimless, or things just don't seem to be going right. I'm sure some of you sitting here today can look back on this past week and think, there was an instant when I missed the mark. That makes sense to me. A second Hebrew word that Jesus might have learned growing up essentially meant to act wrongly, not living into the prophet Amos's vision of loving God and showing kindness and living a just life. There are times when, even though that's our vision, we don't live it. The sermon our life preaches doesn't proclaim God's love, doesn't lean into God's justice, doesn't share that with others. There are moments when our actions, right, they speak louder than our words, and we treat that waiter or waitress with the anger or the frustration we have carrying inside, and then why did I do that? I know that's not right. We miss the mark. We sometimes act wrongly. And the third Hebrew word that Jesus might have learned growing up meant to rebel. How many of you have had an experience sometimes where God is nudging you, maybe to reach out to that person whose voice is like nails on a chalkboard, and you think to yourself, I can't be hearing you right, God. Like some modern day Jonah, we look at our calendars and say, well, I am just too busy to reach out to that person, and what would you look at the time? I gotta go, right? We sometimes resist. We rebel against God's nudges in our life. Other times we rebel and we resist what God has called us to do and to be in this world. Maybe you find yourself this week, your neighbor pulled up in a new car, or with a new boat, or showed you that brand new picture he got of Aaron Rodgers throwing a perfect spiral, right? And you found yourself coveting it, even though you know that's not right. We have these moments of brokenness. We have these times when our actions or our words or things just don't seem to be right within us, and we feel separated, right? We feel some distance from God in those moments. That's the understanding Jesus would have had around this nature of sin. But it was more than just about us as individuals claiming our own brokenness, our own separation, which we need to do. Within the Jewish community, within the Jewish faith, there is also a communal dimension to that kind of brokenness. The Jewish faith is clear on the fact that it's not only us as individuals, it's communal, it's cultural sometimes, the ways that we create or perpetuate brokenness in our lives. Part of the power of the conversation we are going to have in just about a half an hour in our sacred space in the chapel is naming, it's recognizing some of the brokenness that has happened culturally in regards to racism. Those are important conversations. Those are sacred dialogues that we need to keep having as a people of faith. The disciples came to Jesus, and they wanted to know about sin. They wanted Jesus to solve this dilemma, this problem, because they saw a blind man there. And they wanted to know who sinned, that man or his parents. Essentially, in that moment, what the disciples are doing is laying out some kind of spiritual algebraic equation. They see the man, X, and they want to know the value of Y, W-H-Y. Why is this happening? How many of us sometimes find that happening in our own lives, right? We find ourselves struggling with something in our work or our volunteering, some relationship, some struggle that we are having, and we want to know why. Why is this happening? We want Jesus to still solve that spiritual algebraic equation for us today. Or sometimes we solve it ourselves, right? There's somebody in your life who just gets on your nerves, and then something bad happens to that person, and we start talking about just desserts, or we smugly think to ourselves, serves him right. We live sometimes as though faith is that math equation, as though it can simply be solved in our minds. Jesus isn't interested in solving the disciples' problem. He doesn't pick up a piece of chalk and start to write out a solution for them. Instead, he says, neither. Don't try to solve the mystery of life and faith in a linear fashion. There's more to what God is doing in this world. Don't act like the blind man and ignore what God is doing in this world. Instead of trying to solve that equation, Jesus reached out to the man who was blind. And he did that by reaching down. And he picked up some dirt. And when he did that, I want you to hear echoes. Echoes of Genesis 2, where it was God in the beginning, in the second creation story, who reached down and formed out of the dirt, out of the dust, the very first human being. Jesus is in some ways echoing that as he reached down, got that dirt into his hand, spit, and made this paste-like substance that then he went and then applied to the blind man's eyes. Now notice, unlike in other gospel stories where it's the blind man who cries out, shouts out for Jesus to see him, this blind man didn't do anything of the sort. He was just standing there, sitting there, minding his own business. I almost wonder if it startled him a little bit to have Jesus come up and put that paste on his eyes. But the healing, it didn't happen instantly. It wasn't as though it was a hallelujah moment. Jesus then gave him some responsibility. There was a response that the man had to do. He had to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And it was then that he was healed. There's this tension, there's this dance, I think, in the life of faith between knowing our brokenness and also seeing our blessedness. There's this tension in talking not only about sin, but also about grace. A grace that meets us with arms wide open to heal us, to make us whole for the living out of these days. And the point of that grace is not just for us to cling to it as though it's ours and ours alone. The point of the grace has always been to share it. We come into worship and we remember our baptism, where we are claimed by God's grace. But like the blind man who washes in that graceful pool, each of us is sent out into this world to share that grace with each and every person our lives bump up against this week. That dance, that tension between blessedness and brokenness. The Jewish theologian Abraham Herschel was fond of saying that few are guilty, but all are responsible. All of us are responsible to try to respond in the ways that we can in sharing God's grace, God's love with this world. And then we come back every single Sunday to immerse ourselves once again in that grace, to immerse ourselves once again in that love, so that we can go out again into the world and let our light shine, to let the light of Christ shine through us. Gather here to notice and name our blessedness and brokenness, because there's something in naming and noticing that we are surrounded by God's promise of grace, God's promise of love, God's promise to go with us every single hour this week. And friends, that promise never misses the mark. Would you please pray with me?